Here's a representation of a simple experimental design that we can use to examine not just this, but many other questions. Indeed, some of my lesser known works use exactly this design. It's a 2 by 2 by 2 design, and the geometric representation makes it particularly intuitive. Not only is it simple, but it can be generalized to a slightly more complex case without unduly increasing the complexity. Here is what you get in that case. And this is the preliminary model that was used by the scholars whose scrolls are preserved in our family home. They carried out some bizarre experiments, however, and I don't know whether I should read this to you. Perhaps in the interest of time, I'll just give you an English translation. This asks how many animals of each kind Moses took with him on the ark. And obviously this was administered to a group of university students, because the answer was always 2. Perhaps not too surprising until you realize that the question ought to have been how many of animals of each kind did Noah bring with him on the ark. I find this kind of thing deeply distressing when people do it to me. Psychologists clearly devised this experiment, and its sole purpose is to humiliate and to make you feel that if only you'd been paying attention, you certainly wouldn't have made a mistake. That certainly was my explanation when I was caught out by the same trick. My older brother read it to me in Hebrew, which was difficult, of course, in particular, and I completely failed to notice the wrong word in the middle of the question. Moving on to the analysis of the data, because the problem was that most of the scrolls were literary in nature. So they waxed lyrical about the virtues of Latke-Hamantash. They assaulted and assailed the principles, morals, and intelligence of previous writers on the subject. But I felt that as a statistician and a methodologist, I ought to instead bring you an objective analysis of the data. And the kind of thing I did, and I pleaded with the organizers, but they refused to allow me to present more than one of the experiments. This is an experiment that demonstrates the effect of priming and horizontal or vertical orientation on the percentage answering prefer latkes. Now, if only you had all of the other results available to you, you would be much more interested. However, despite my pleas, the organizers were adamant and refused to allow me to go any further, and I was forced as a result to present instead a simple statistical formula. This is a model. I don't recommend it exactly, but it's better than anybody has done before. I will be producing a better model shortly after the holidays. This includes only 3 of the factors that I mentioned before. One is whether you eat alone or with someone else. The other is how fresh the materials are. And the prepared by mother other was statistically significant in all of the analyses. So that really has to be maintained here. And the model is looking at the latke-hamentaschen ratio. A concept I expect will be mentioned frequently in debates in future years, although so far I think is unknown. Here are the results in their simplest form. It is almost insulting to your intelligence to go through these numbers. So I won't. Suffice it to say that it is perfectly clear that at whatever time these data were collected, latkes were greatly preferred over hamantaschen. Now, I noticed among some of you an air of skepticism, subtle, but noticeable, that perhaps you felt that these were not really data that we have at home. Well, skeptical you may be, but through the good offices of Dick Rubin, whose aunt's husband, Ralph Marcus, used to teach at the Oriental Institute, I was able to use influence, which I understand is not unknown in these circles, to use influence to obtain access to a map of an area that many of you will recognize. And I noticed an imperfection in the upper part of the map where something had clearly been removed. Clearly being removed is perhaps not the best way to put it. Something had been removed. I first sent the map to the staff of CSI Miami, whose work I had whose work I had admired on television. I don't know if you realize this, it turns out that they are actors. So I was forced to return to the university to have the map examined. And using techniques similar to those that were used for the Turin Shroud, it turns out when this map was properly processed, there was previously erased an annotation of the camp of Murhertuk, the navigator himself, who had visited sometime in the past and brought back with him the scrolls that I have been happy to share with you this evening. Thank you.